So good evening and welcome to our webinar on managing stress for BIPOC youth presented by TYSA and Beitul Jamaat House of Community. My name is Sean Ghazala and I am the Behavioral Health Manager at the Staten Island Partnership for Community Wellness and the coordinator of TYSA, a coalition of individuals and organizations in the community working collectively to improve the behavioral health of youth on Staten Island, namely improving mental health outcomes and decreasing substance use for our youth. I will moderate tonight's panel discussion. But before I go any further, I want to hand it to our partner, Dr. Morgan, representing Beitul Jamaat, to welcome you all.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Aaliyah Morgan. I'm a physician, primary care physician, and one of my major honors is being a founding board member of Beitul Jamaat, which is House of Community. Our mission is to provide food security, educational series of various programs, advocacy, support, and mental health awareness to the underserved community members borough-wide here, starting with our home base of Staten Island. Tonight, we have once again joined the ranks with TYSA and other partners to bring you this important topic of discussion, managing stress amongst our BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, persons of color, youth. We have some very powerful guest speakers who are joining us tonight. And I will pass this off back to Sean Ghazala, who will introduce the rest of the panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Morgan.
You're welcome.
So we're here this evening because we recognize that our children are under incredible pressure. There's the pressure of their education, going to school, getting good grades, can be stressful, making and maintaining relationships, friendship, perhaps dealing with bullies. Depending on their age, they may be dating or seeking a relationship. There's transitions that they're facing, trying to fit into new environments. Perhaps they're just entering high school or in a new school building or learning remotely for the first time. That can be its own pressure. There's social media, pop culture. Certainly there's drugs like alcohol or other substances, including vaping. Then, of course, the pandemic adds its own pressures that we are all navigating through. And when we're talking about our Black, Indigenous people of color, we also know that racism and racist systems also apply their share of pressure in all of these realms. So to help support our parents and caregivers, we've assembled a panel of experts from the community to share their expertise with us and to answer your questions on how to best support your child in managing their stress in these challenging times. So with us this evening is Tiffany Watson, the Director of School-Based Mental Health, Zainab Abdulrahim, a mental health counselor, and Dr. Robert Power, the Clinical Program Director of Buprenorphine Services at Community Health Action of Staten Island. Before I hand it to Tiffany to begin, I'd like to invite folks watching to submit any questions you may have in the chat. After our three panelists' remarks, we're going to be making space to answer your questions. So feel free to directly message them to me or drop them into the chat at any time throughout this. But with that said, I'd like to hand it to Tiffany Watson, the Director of School-Based Mental Health. Tiffany.
Thank you, Sean. Good evening, everyone. So like Sean said, I am Tiffany Watson-Labate. I am an LMHC as my title as far as licensure, and I am the Director of School-Based Services. I started out in Curtis, just being the Director of the School-Based Mental Health there. And now I also oversee 3 other clinics, 2 being in Washington Heights and 1 being in the South Bronx. So basically what I kind of bring into the table as far as when we're looking at managing stress for BIPOC youth, we're in the schools, we're seeing what's happening with our youth that are what they present with. One of the major things that they are coming in with, right? Our kids have been out of school for 2 years. Even if they were there last year, it was this hybrid if they were in school at all, right? Because some students had that fully remote option. So we're also just learning how to build capacity back. So I know a lot of parents and teachers and staff are concerned right now about like ADHD or other issues where they're like they can't concentrate, things are happening. Some of that is just building back capacity, right? Our kids were kind of seeing, and this was things that are being told to us by our kids, that it was optional, right? School felt optional and it didn't feel like it was school. And now we're asking them to be back in the building and they're there for 6 or 7 hours. So they have to learn how to build that capacity back, especially for our younger kids. Some of them might not have ever stepped foot in the building. And so they don't know what that feels like, right? So we have to try to make that time and space to let them adjust back. And it is being in the school, it's hard, right? A lot of the kids, there's constantly someone else out, maybe the teacher's out, classes are being reorganized. There's also a lot of stress that happens in the building. I can tell you that, at my particular site at Curtis, we were shut down right before Christmas because of the rising numbers inside of our building, right? That also creates stress. So our children are seeing the stress of a pandemic. There's racism that's happening around them and they're dealing with that, right? So a lot of the schools that I work with are all Title I schools, so that we know that we're working with youth that are BIPOC and usually low socioeconomic status. Those are things that they always bring into the building with them and they're carrying around with them, right? So we want to remember that the same way that adults experience racism, our kids are experiencing that, right? Like checking in and kind of seeing how that is for them. Some of this stuff feels like big topics, but we want to have those kind of conversations because they know things are happening around them, but sometimes we don't want to have that conversation with them, but we can have appropriate level conversations with our kids to kind of just check in and see, because they see the world that's happening around them. They're hearing of the different things that are going on, right? So like finding a way to check in with them, because it is something that's happening for them as well. And they have brought that into sessions with us, as well as looking at, there's a pandemic going on. A lot of our parents will say like, my kid isn't back where they used to be. And, they're not doing the same things. It's even like kind of looking at, we need to have some space there too, that these kids haven't gone through schooling in a pandemic. And where we've kind of given some of our adults a pass to say like, hey, this is some new uncharted ground and, we need to find some time to find our footing, like so do our youth, right? And it's a lot because they're being asked to do the same exact standards of where they were 2 years ago before a pandemic. And they're being asked to do that now when the world is also changing and shifting constantly around them. We have a lot of youth that are now taking care of siblings, who went out and got jobs during the pandemic because it helped their family. And now they're kind of back in like, hey, do I continue working? Do I not do my homework so I can help, to continue working? These are stresses that sometimes we're not looking at and we don't realize. And not that we're, intentionally not trying to think about it, but as things are moving, right? I'm a parent myself and I've, and I'm a mental health counselor and I've, kind of sometimes forgot the load that's on my own, child. And I have a teenager and a little one. And then just kind of seeing, those different aspects that are happening, right? So the one thing I would definitely say is making sure we're checking in. We know that the rates have gone up as far as depression, anxiety, any other, other mental health issues, as well as, suicidal ideation, attempts, completion, and self-harm, right? So these are things where we know they're going on and we can try to start conversations. Just doing basic check-ins, sometimes with our kids, just seeing where they are. Like, do you notice that there's a little something different? Those are ways that our kids can start opening conversations, because a lot of times they'll say they don't want to burden their parent with it. But if you're also maybe bringing this into the conversation and making that safe space where they can have that conversation, it's allowing them to feel comfortable to kind of share, and they don't feel like maybe they are burdening you or putting something out there that you are not prepared to handle. And then I would also say, if you're not really prepared in that moment, maybe don't have that conversation just yet. But for yourself, begin to process that. And then there are steps that you can, smaller steps that you can take. But I would definitely say just building a space for our youth to even have comfortable conversations with inside the home. Check in with teachers, with some of the outside people, because our kids are bringing a lot of things in and they are dealing with lots of different pressures. There's school, the pandemic, racism, their own kind of issues with their, maintaining their own their own emotional health, as well as navigating friendships and different things. So when you look at it, they have a very big complexity of problems, even though we don't sometimes as adults see them as the same problems. But, for your child, when that's their life and that's all they know, it's a big deal for them, right? So when some of these things happen, it's world ending for them, even if it's not for you. And we need to remember as adults, what we see as problems, they might not see, right? Because now we are in different planes and we don't operate the same way. So my last piece would be just kind of validating. It might not seem like a big deal for you, but if they're saying it's a big deal to them, validate that piece and then, find ways where you can support. And the one last thing I would just kind of say is, it's okay to sit there and ask your child what they need. Do they want space and time, or do they want to actively have comfort and support, right? I think there is a space to say, what do you need? It's allowing them to have that independence, and it helps them to also self-regulate and know when to ask for help and when they kind of need to just have space to themselves. And we're not forcing a support on them that they don't want or maybe can't handle at that moment. And just, allowing to say, I'm here when you're ready, then you can come back to me, right? Again, it's creating a space, they feel safe. And when they maybe are in that moment to be able to speak to you, they know that they can. But that's what I have to share for now. So thank you.
Yes, thank you, Tiffany. That was great. So I'm going to hand it to Zainab Abdulrahim, a mental health counselor, to pick up where Tiffany left off. Zainab, please.
I would be the wonderful genius to continue speaking while I'm mute. Hello, everyone. Story of my life. Thank you so much for having me back. I'm really excited to be here. Okay, so kind of piggybacking off of a lot of the points that Tiffany made. I honestly speaking, I would agree with everything that she said. I think our youth, specifically Black and Indigenous youth, we're struggling. We're struggling big time. We're struggling with anxiety, depression. Yes, a lot of it is due to the pandemic, but we were also struggling pre-pandemic as well, right? We're facing persistent racism, widening inequalities, and our youth are not unaware of what's happening, right? And this is impacting their mental health. One of the things that I tend to see a lot of, because specifically I work with predominantly Muslim youth, one of the things that I tend to see a lot of is our youth not feeling heard and understood by their parents, having a very different lived experience from their parents, especially those of our youth that may come from parents that are not native to America per se, or they may be, first generation Americans. So they have a very different experience and they're feeling unseen and unheard by their parents. They're curious about their sexuality in a way that is just uncomfortable for many of their parents to talk about, right? You have this religious component that tells you that, certain things are restricted because of religion and tradition and things of that nature, but parents are unwilling to have these conversations with our children, right? So that we can support them in processing them. This is not to convince you to believe one thing or the other, but support is important for our children so that they feel heard and feel seen. And oftentimes That's one of the biggest things that I hear within our community, is that they don't feel heard, they don't feel seen, they're not given the opportunity to have these honest conversations with their families. And it leads to a lot of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideations. Unfortunately, that is on the rise. We've been seeing it in the media. It's definitely on the rise within our youth. And they're just really not feeling like they're being, what is important to them doesn't seem to be important to the adults around them. So, and that seems to be one of the larger struggles. So one of the things, and I'm going to keep my talk really brief, one of the suggestions or the tips that I would provide is really listening to their ideas without adding any information, right? Don't take away from it, don't add to it, just hear your children. Just listen. Asking their opinions, right? Finding out, staying curious. I always say, stay curious about how our kids feel. I tend to go back and give examples of my 7-year-old. You know, when we're conversing, she's like, I try to do this. I'm not always great at this, but she'll like tell me, you know, she's listening, and I immediately have this knee-jerk response to want to solve her problem, right? And as parents, this is what we want to do. Like, we want to solve our kids' problems because that's what we're here for, or so we think. And I have to kind of bite my tongue and say, no, don't try to solve her problem. Just really listen to what she has to say and stay curious about what she's saying, and then ask her opinion, right? This is how they know, this is how they learn independence and autonomy, and understand that they have agency as well, right? Agency is imparted on them from their parents. They learn this from us, but they gain it really on their own through their own life experiences. You know, respecting their boundaries, right? I think that that is something that is really, really important for our youth. Respecting the boundaries that they've set for themselves, right? Like if they need space and they're not ready to talk to us in the moment, let them know that the door is always open, but respecting the fact that they need space in this moment. Giving them choices. And I think, and again, a lot of what I say is really specific to religious communities, whether it's a Muslim or a Christian or a Jewish community. I think that oftentimes we allow our religious beliefs to shame our children without giving them space to really just express what they feel, without feeling like when they do, they are wrong in the eyes of God, right? So really just holding space, once again, for our children to express themselves. Like, this is not a religious debate. This is not a religious conversation. I am just communicating with you, Mom. I'm just telling you how I feel, Dad. And that shouldn't be filtered necessarily through the eyes of our religious beliefs, always, right? And then communicating with your children openly. I have a lot of open conversations with my daughter, and I have a lot of open conversations with our youth, letting them know about my personal struggles, you know, growing up. And I think I shared this the last time we were on together, some of the struggles that I faced as a Muslim youth, being the only, you know, brown girl in a class full of people who did not look like me. They were Muslim, but they didn't look like me. We didn't necessarily have the same upbringing. They may have been Arab or Desi or from another culture. So while we shared a religious belief, we did not share the same culture. And that definitely brought on a lot of trauma for me. And I try to address that with my daughter because she is one of the only brown girls. I mean, you know, they're all brown, but she's one of the only brown Black girls in her class. And I'm constantly checking in. Well, how are you feeling? How do you identify in a sea of beautiful girls, all beautiful brown girls who don't necessarily look like you? You know, are you secure enough in your, we always say beautiful brown, so forgive me, I'm not trying to sound, you know, politically correct. It's just how I describe it for her, because I think it's important to attach beauty to how we look, to how we're created, not how we look. So I ask her, you know, how do you feel being a beautiful brown girl in that space? Like, I'm constantly checking in with her regarding that, because I think it's important. Again, this is completely separate from religion. Just having these conversations, recognizing that there are differences, and we don't shy away from them, but we hold the door for them. We open the door for them. So yeah, and I mean, again, if the overarching thing that I would say here, the overarching theme of what I'm saying here today, rather, is really just staying curious and holding space for our children. They are going through an array of emotions the same way we are, right? Hold space for them. Stay genuinely curious about what it is that they're feeling, and fight the urge to correct them. So, thank you.
Thank you, Zainab. Very interesting. We're getting a lot of comments in the chat of empathy and support for your comments. So thank you, Zainab.
Thank you.
So before we continue on, I want to encourage folks watching to submit any questions you may have in the chat. We've started to, they're starting to roll in, but we just want to encourage you to send in any questions you might have, so our panel can field them after our last remarks here. So before we go to that Q&A session, I'd like to hand it to Dr. Robert Power. He's the Clinical Program Director of Buprenorphine Services at Community Health Action of Staten Island. Dr. Power, please.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Sean. I'm going to address this topic in another different perspective, but it's in line to what everyone else has been sharing. We're asking children to adapt and to adjust to both environmental and cultural situations that they may not have the skills to really adjust to, or be just able to deal with on a level. And a lot of times these individuals and these youth use substances to help them dissipate some of the anxiety and attention that these stress cause. And from a study from the Center on Addiction, nearly half of the youth in America experience some type of high stress. And youth who experience these type of high stress are 3 times as likely to use marijuana, twice as likely to use alcohol, and almost twice as likely to use tobacco. And the report states that a number of these issues, or the stress, number one source of these stress, are academic pressures, including pressures to do well in school, trying to get into college. And sadly, not everybody can get that easy A. Not everybody can get that perfect grade. And if for adults, we work hard and we sometimes have unsatisfactory results and we face tremendous disappointments. And it's only because we've learned certain coping skills and mechanisms that we're able to deal with that. However, we're asking adolescents who's already going through biological changes, having developed the capacity to think rationally, to manage some of these stressful and alarming situations. And it's very easy because now the majority of their influence is not coming from home anymore. It's coming from their peers and the people that they surround themselves with. So now these people and individuals may influence them to subscribe to some type of substance. And let's be honest, drugs work because they give the desired effect and the desired results that they're looking for. And beyond occupation or academical pressures, you have youth who's looking, lives may include other anxiety triggers such as social stress, family discord, world events, traumatic events, and other significant life changes. And they may not have the ability to navigate life that way. They may not have the ability to manage these stress changes. And so the only way they know, or the only way they've been shown, let me say that, to dissipate these physical responses to the emotional events that they're experiencing is through the assistance of substances. So I just want to kind of share with these caregivers some of the maybe about 6 tips to watch for when you because kids don't know that they're dealing with stress, but however, their behaviors and dispositions and personas change, and we as caregivers have to be mindful of those changes. So one of the things is you'll see an emotional change. While some anxious youth experience or express feelings as worry or experience subtle emotional changes as feeling keyed up, feeling on edge, irritability, difficult concentration, restlessness, and unexplained outbursts. So when you start seeing some of these things, you will know that this is something that they're dealing with, some type of stressful event that they're dealing with. Social changes. Stress can negatively affect their normal peer circle. So once you see your youth suddenly avoid his favorite activities, stop making plans with his and her friends, and you might start just looking at that. You know, if you notice that your child is avoiding social interactions, avoiding extracurricular activities that they normally would be doing, isolating from their normal peer group, or even spending increased time alone. These are some of the signals that your child may be undergoing some stress or anxiety. The next tip is physical changes. Many of the physical complaints that can occur with stress mimic average everyday complaints from not only teens, but adults, which they tend to increase as they get older. So pay attention to patterns, like a couple of headaches here and there that shouldn't be cause for alarm. However, frequent headaches are a red flag. And watch out for having problems with their stomach. You know, you can't, nervousness, unexplained fatigue or excess fatigue, having complaints of not feeling well with obviously no medical cause, change in the eating habits. So those are some of the things as far as physical changes that you should be on alert for just watching. The next thing that I would talk about that's very prominent is sleep disturbances. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that a youth should get anywhere from 8 to 10 hours of sleep on a regular basis just to promote optimal health, right? So part of this is making sure they recommend that they shut down their telephones and screens 30 minutes before bedtime, removing all electronics from the bedroom. But it's no big secret that homework and this change of hybrid school systems, extracurricular activities, sometimes you can't, just can't be done in a appropriate time, So therefore, it can be difficult to know whether it's actual fatigue or it's a product of stress or a product of that busy schedule. So what we watch out for is having difficulty sleeping at night, right? Having difficulty staying asleep, expressing that they're having frequent nightmares, not feeling refreshed after long hours of sleep, falling asleep in school. So these are some of the sleep disturbances that we look at to see, is there something more going on? Another kind of red flag for us that one of our youths are experiencing tension or stress is poor school performance. Given that stress can affect everything from sleeping habits to eating habits to missing school to physical issues, it comes as no surprise that poor academic performance is a result from unaddressed stress. School avoidance, missing days due to anxiety or stress feeling or not being able to deal with the stress of going to school or performing or handling exams or tests, persistent worries that make them difficult for them to even address some of the issues at school because they are afraid of failing and afraid of doing bad for their parents. So in this area, we try to look for significant jumps in grades. Normally it's on the downward spiral. Frequently missed assignments. So if you know that your child gets homework every day, and for the last 2 weeks, they tell you they don't have any homework, that should be a red flag. Describing feelings of feeling overwhelmed by the school workload when normally they can manage it at a very decent pace. Procrastinates or have difficulty concentrating on their homework. So not only are they not doing their homework, but they're procrastinating and turning in their normal assignments. And then finally, if you notice that your child is experiencing what I would call panic attacks, physical responses to their stressful environments. Not all youths have panic attacks or experience panic attacks. However, you may see mild symptoms here and there, or you may see responses to certain events that makes them feel stressed or stressful. So the physical responses will be a rapid heartbeat, continuous sweating and trembling, dizziness. We already spoke about the upset stomach, finding it very difficult to breathe, chest pains. They tell you that they feel like they're dying. They feel like they're going crazy, numbness or tingling in the arms and legs, and derealization, over dramatized or under dramatized in a situation. So those are the certain things that we should be on alert for as caregivers in our population, this Black brown population, that we should be alert for and watchful for in our children, that we can help them manage their stress in a more healthy way. Other factors that help reduce the use of substance abuse due to stress for our population is environmental support. As everybody's said the same thing, that it's important. This is, for me, is probably one of the most important set of factors that reduces youth involvement in substances, is having a safe space. And youth need to feel like they need to feel like they're being heard, they're being listened to. So a safe environment must not only be safe physically, but it has to be safe mentally, has to be safe morally, and it has to be safe socially. And all these things will make them feel free to be able to share emotions that they would normally share every day. And it's in this context where youth will reduce their negative responses to stress in their environments. The next factor to reduce substance use due to stress for youth is social support. The availability of social support is also important. Studies have shown that emotional support from others, I should say, when experiencing stress, helps them to manage these stressful symptoms better than if they didn't have any support at all. So if they know they can have a good, strong social circle, that they can talk about their problems, talk about their feelings, be able to address some of these issues that they may feel uncomfortable to talk about with others. If they have a strong social support, that would help them manage these uncomfortable and dissipate some of this anxiety that they're feeling, versus if they didn't have a social support. And my final area that I believe that will help reduce some of the substance use risk is implementing cultural appropriate strategies. Culture has a strong influence on the development of stress in our community. We come from a culture already that's very traumatic and a stressful background. And due to that magnitude is that stress and anxiety has been passed down from one generation to the other. And many of us have been taught to manage it. Some of us have not been taught to manage it. So whatever skills that was presented to that child to learn how to deal with stress is all they know. Nationwide studies show that BIPOC youth have higher rates of suffering from stress compared to whites and other communities, according to a study done in 2011. And this may be due to, like I said, being racially profiled, pressure living in a community that's economically depressed, and the lack of or access to proper care and services. So we have to understand in that context that not only are they suffering from racially being profiled, but lack of health care, a pandemic that has restricted their social movement. So they need more culturally appropriate strategies to be able to understand that you're not alone. You're not by yourself. There's others who are going through the same thing. And this is what they've done to overcome some of the emotions and feelings that they're dealing with. And I believe that by just taking those few steps, we can reduce the number of our youth that's exposed to negative behaviors based on dealing with trying to dissipate some of the feelings or emotional responses that come with dealing with stress. Thank you very much, Sean, and I turn it back to you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Power. Before we bring all of your questions to our panel, I'd like to plug an upcoming sequel to this event. Let's see if I can share my screen. There. So on February 28th, we're going to have, as I said, a sequel to this event that's going to be youth-led. As the flyer pictured states, young people often, and as we've talked about in this webinar so far, young people don't often talk about their mental health concerns because of stigma and many other factors. So we will be featuring some young folks that are going to share how they navigate stress and the pressures they face. And if you know of any person under the age of 25 who'd like to participate and share their experiences, please have them reach out to me by email, and I'll put that in the chat and say it out loud. It's Sean, S-E-A-N, at sipcw.org. Please have any young people reach out to us. We want to hear their voice. We want to give our young people some good examples of what's working in the community and what others find work for them. So please join us on February 28th at 6 p.m. So our questions. The first question we received, what are the panelists' thoughts on the reasoning behind all of these dilemmas that youth are facing, particularly now? And I think just to add some context to the question, right? In recent news, we've heard about here in our community, right? Threats on social media, violence being seen in schools, fights. What does our panel think is behind all of that? And some of it may be obvious, but also some of it may be less obvious. Whoever would like to start with that
one. I'll jump in. So I believe a lot of this is coming from is lack of emotional regulation, right? So kind of to mimic off of, or not, jump off of what Dr. Pyro was saying, right? We learned ways to cope. And some of that we learned by modeling from our parents. We learned it from socially, from our friends and other people. I believe there was a lot of regression that occurred over 2 years. We have kids that don't even know how to speak to each other in person, right? Because they were used to saying, okay, hey, I have 5 minutes, 10 minutes a day to respond back to someone, right? Even like their anger, they weren't really seeing each other. Now they're seeing each other. They don't really know how to interact with each other, even on a basic social level, to say hello. And right, and aggression and anger is an easy go-to emotion. And a lot of times that comes with, anger is these aggressive behaviors that become problematic, right? So we're seeing the increased fighting, be it physical or just like arguing, or seeing kids lash out, right? But I think there's just so much that's happening inside and they don't know what to do with it. So then it comes out in this expressed kind of aggressive rage. And that's how we then see it, right? So it's unexpressed emotions at times. I like to tell people a lot of times that anger isn't bad, right? Anger as an emotion is not bad. It's the behaviors that tend to associate with anger, right? You could be angry and then say, hey, I need 5 minutes to cool off and I'm gonna go separate myself or take a walk or yell into a pillow. Or you can be a person, I'm angry and I'm gonna punch you in the face right now, right? So it's a lot of times, it's not just looking at the emotions, it's the behaviors that come with the emotions and like teaching some of those pieces, right? Like this is your emotion, but how do we find a way to cope with that emotion? And there is some psychoeducation that comes with that. But we have seen it. I've been in a, unfortunately, I work in a school building. Curtis was one of those schools that we thought there was a gun threat. And kids didn't come to school for 3 days, right? So not only are they dealing with everything else, they're being told that like, hey, you come to school, you're gonna get shot. And there's not a real way for us to say that's not accurate because we see school shootings. We know that it's happening and everyone says not New York, but why can't it be New York? So I do think there was a lot of regression that happened. And then these are kids that also maybe didn't have some of those skills to begin with. So now if you didn't have those skills and you regressed and lost some of those skills, I think it's kind of putting people back to that more basic way of interacting. And that's going to be more behavioral than it is in a cognitive speaking level.
Thank you, Tiffany. Would anybody like to add to that? Zainab or Robert?
All right, what was the, can you just repeat the question again? I'm sorry.
Not to worry. What could explain all of sort of these emerging sort of issues that have popped up in schools recently, whether it be threats on social media or fights or the like happening in our schools?
For me, I just look at this. Violence is the language of people who are felt unheard. And many times, even with this population, this is probably one of the generations that's probably the least socially engaged that I've ever seen. And they haven't developed the social nuances of just being cordial, of being able to agree to disagree. Part of that, and I spoke about this previously, is that COVID increased the isolation that was established through gaming. I think that gaming caused a lot of social isolation and the social reward that they feel in gaming, from winning prizes to going to the next levels, these rewards outplayed the benefit of being socially engaged with their peers at their levels. So now, instead of socializing, going outside and playing and just interacting with their peers, majority of their focus now, and the pandemic has increased that isolation, has been focused on gaming and staying in tune with one-on-one activities instead of being in group activities, social activities, where they can learn how to negotiate relationships in a way that would help them deal with some of the social nuances of life. And that's a big part of it. We have to learn and re-socialize these youth, because the pandemic has put them in a place of isolation where they haven't been social. They haven't learned how to deal with someone outside of their culture. They haven't learned how to deal with people with different ideals or different thought patterns. And because I don't think like you or you don't think like me, my next step is to turn to violence. And that's something that we in the Black, that's something that we in the Black community have to really work on, because our culture has been through enough violence already. We've been through enough stress and enough heartaches to where now let's start to work on communicating, teaching our kids to communicate, not only communicate with each other, but communicate with other authorities, because violence doesn't bring change, communication does. Saying what you have to say in a way to let people understand that this is what you stand for, that's what brings change. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just piggyback off of what Dr. Powers mentioned as well. I agree. I think that frustration, unexpressed frustration can definitely absolutely lead to violence, right? But I think there's so many different reasons, so we don't necessarily know exactly what it is. But what I think is really important is that when we have events like this, when we, and there are a lot, what are the action steps that we're taking to implement, one, what we're learning, and how are we supporting our youth going forward? Because I think that oftentimes, and I see this a lot within our community, we're having a lot of events around mental health awareness, talking about therapy, the importance of it, but there aren't any tangible action steps that are being taken to really address what our youth is communicating to us. And I think that it's important that we actually begin to do things where we're actually addressing the issues that they bring to us, one, and then two, giving them the grace to kind of make mistakes as they navigate, adolescence. Because I oftentimes feel like our youth is not given the grace that, well, I think just generationally, we don't give grace. And that is a whole issue in and of itself, possibly related to slavery and all of that other stuff, because we didn't have the luxury of giving grace, right? If you did, you may not have made it to the other side. Having said that, though, I think that we are in a different space and in a different time. And I think it is important that we hold space for our youth to, one, make a mistake, and two, support them in navigating their emotions, like teaching them emotional regulation. But when they get it wrong, being there to say, hey, you made it wrong. You're not wrong. You made a poor choice. And I think that that's important for our youth as well. So.
Thank you. So for our next question, what suggestions does the panel have for a child with special needs? It can be hard to have conversations with a neurotypical child, and with a child on the spectrum with special needs, it can be especially difficult to have these sorts of conversations. So any tips from our panel?
I guess, I'll talk about my experiences as well. I do have a child that is neurodiverse. She's not on the spectrum, but she does have some sensory processing issues. I do let her take the lead on a lot. And not that she's the parent, or I'm not parentalizing her. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But I stay curious enough to just, kind of follow her a little bit. What are you up to? Like, what's going on in that brain of yours? I'm very curious. Like, I am like the scientist is like observing from the sideline, taking notes. But in all seriousness, staying curious about, what it is that she's experiencing, what it is that she's doing, and then trying to tailor my questions around or my conversations around that. Maybe reading a book on a topic that I like to address that is age appropriate for her, and allow that to bring about an organic conversation with her, using examples in nature to have these types of conversations with her. Again, my daughter is 7, so understand the context of that conversation. Finding age appropriate material for her to read about certain topics. Understanding what violence is. If you're asking specifically, having these difficult conversations around violence, having her understand what violence is and what violating someone looks like. and what her person being violated looks like as well. So those are some of the things that I do just personally.
Yeah, so I have experience with working with adults that are on the spectrum or have pervasive issues, seeing Down syndrome, other issues, you know, other disorders on that spectrum. But I would also just say, however you teach them, however you speak with them, however you interact with them, staying on that same level, right? So you found a way that works, that you can, you know, share information, they're able to obtain it and understand it, and then just kind of put it into the context of what you're trying to get out of it. Right? So it's like you don't have to create the wheel again, right? The wheel's there. Like if it ain't broke, right? And then you just kind of use it that way, right? So a lot of times we think that we don't have certain skills, but we do. We just need to change the parameters around them. Right? So everyone goes, oh, well, I don't know how to parent maybe an adolescent. You do, you just have to change what you did maybe when they were 5 to when they're 15. So I would say the same thing for someone whose child might be neurodivergent or on the spectrum. It's kind of, you already found a way that works for you to communicate with your child, and then just making whatever that conversation is appropriate to their level. And maybe they won't have a full grasp of everything that's happening, and that's okay too, but they'll have at least something where you're opening that space and it could flourish, where they can, you know, gain the capacity to learn more and talk more, and, you know, as time goes on, but you've already started and left a foundation. My piece is, I always like saying, I like planting seeds. So maybe it's not going to stick in the moment, but you planted that seed to, which I kind of love what Zainab says, right? Be curious, right? That seed can grow into the biggest tree or garden one day, and maybe it won't, but you left them with something that someone else can't take away.
Thank you. Okay. Our next question was a follow-up to the remarks Zainab had. So maybe we'll start with you, Zainab, for this question, but then if any of the other panelists want to add to it. You brought an excellent point, Zainab, when you brought up the religious aspect of how children might feel they're viewed by their parents. How can parents start these conversations with their youth if parents themselves don't know where to start?
That's a really good question, but I would first say, you know, first of all, transparency builds trust, right? So saying just that, this is an uncomfortable conversation for me, right? I don't know where to start, right? So one, transparency is always disarming, right? So if I'm saying that I don't necessarily have all the answers, that holds space for you to provide some of those answers as well. So one, starting with that, right? And that's a way to really connect with a young person, not coming from a place of authority, but actually saying, you know, I don't have all the answers. I know what you're dealing with. I can only imagine what you're dealing with. It's really hard. Like whenever I'm working with a client and they're telling me something, I don't jump to resolve their problems. I immediately acknowledge, wow, hearing that is really difficult. So living it must be tremendous. I can only imagine what that feels like. So first and foremost, starting by saying that you don't necessarily have the answers, right? But you can't end there because you do have to actually have a conversation. So if you don't necessarily have the answers, just listen, just be there as a listening ear for your children in having that conversation. And if you don't have the answer in the moment, validate what they're saying and let them know, you know, listen, we can table this for right now. Maybe reach out, have some, you know, professionals in your toolbox, you know, reach out to any, you know, mental health professionals or people who work with children and, you know, kind of pick their brains a little bit. You know, my child is experiencing this. What do you think? How do you think I should proceed with this? How do you think I should handle this? What are some talking strategies, ways that I can continue to get my child to open up? Because they did open up to me and I want to continue that dialogue, but I don't necessarily have the language. Right? So I think, again, parents humbling themselves enough to actually go out and seek the help that they need to have these conversations as well. So again, authentic conversation, staying curious, reaching out to your support system, gathering a support system if you don't have one. You know, reaching out to organizations like Beitul Jamaat, TYSA, Dr. Powers, Tiffany, like reaching out to the people in your, I always say your toolbox, and hey, what do you think I should say? How do you think I should handle it?
I think that you hit that right on the head. Part of my education has been in religious studies, and part of it is understanding that my belief, and it's just my belief, is that whether you're an imam or you're a pastor, that's where the counseling port has started for our population, from elders, and it's when we walked away, or when these individuals, I should say, began to abuse the authority that they have, that they went elsewhere to seek counseling resources. So we have to remember that counseling started within the faith community. That's just my belief. So in saying that, part of this is understanding that by being honest and saying that you don't know, and letting your child know, sometimes the parent has to become the student, and the child becomes the teacher. And we cannot be too old to learn. And we cannot allow ourselves to be so rigid in our faith to where we push our children away.
That's right.
And faith is supposed to be a tool, not a weapon.
Right.
So it's our responsibility as believers of our faith to use that tool to be able to build up the child in a way to where they can be healthy, both not only physically, emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. And it's all these things that we put in our little, as you said, your toolbox, is all these things that we do that we allow our child to grow. But not only are they growing, as they grow, we grow, because we're learning new techniques and we're learning new ways. And now we're enhancing our lives because our child is teaching us not only how to deal with them, but how to deal with others as well. And we cannot walk away from the experience of learning how to be better people by teaching our child to teach us how to be better parents or better caregivers. Thank you.
Thank you both. So just 2 questions left. If folks have any, please drop them in the chat. How does science and faith, stigma and morality interact when we're supporting one with substance use disorder?
Okay, that's a very good question. So for me, I am a very faith-based person. My faith is very important to me, and that I believe that that is the part of the passion that I use to treat people who suffer from substance abuse disorder. Part of that passion comes out in meeting people where they are, meaning that I know the counseling techniques, I know the terminologies, I know all the things, but I don't know what is causing their substance use or what things are driving them to use substances. So it's my job for them to teach me. And as they're teaching me how or what they're doing or what's causing to drive their substance use, now it's my job to give them alternative means in learning how to manage life without those substance uses, or without using a substance, I should say. And once you give people choices, because this is a partnership, it's not a dictatorship. I can't tell them that you have to do X, Y, Z. My job is to make suggestions, to point out some of the things that I'm seeing. If a person tells me that they want to do X, Y, Z, but their behavior is totally different, the opposite of what they're saying, then I have to point that out. Well, it's very hard for you to drive a car without taking driver's lessons or getting your permit. So let's plan on you doing X, Y, Z to get your permit, and then you can work to get your license, and we can put that goal in place. But if you don't set real expectations and allow people to not only teach you so that you can teach them and become to them, in humble hands, and let them know, look, I'm not the expert in your life. You know your life better than anybody that you know. And help me to help the expert become a better person. Because it's not about science. It's not about techniques. Everything we learn in life is from somebody modeling it to us. It's from riding a bike, playing basketball, dating, whatever it is. We learn by watching someone else. So as they watch us live life without substances, now we watch them and show them what suggestions we may have, but we model that we model the life that we want them to be able to enjoy. And when they start to see the benefits of living this life without a substance, they're going to want to know more. They're going to want to be more curious. They're going to want to come after it. But it comes in meeting them where they're at with no judgment, no hard feelings. If they fail, accept their failure and pick them back up, and just embrace that whole approach. Because in embracing that approach and embracing that format, it lets them know that we accept them for who they are, because there's no perfect people in this world. And we accept imperfect people because it's these imperfect people that help us to make a perfect place. So if a jigsaw puzzle has many imperfect pieces, and it takes to make a perfect picture, such as life. And it takes every piece of this puzzle to work in order to make a perfect piece, a perfect picture. I'm sorry, but thank you.
I would also just add that also just in my experience of doing therapy, and now I don't really do therapy as much, I just kind of give supervision on it. Religion sometimes comes with guilt and judgment, regardless of whatever background that you're coming from, right? So, when they joke around, that's Jewish guilt, that's Catholic guilt, that's this, right? But it's not a joke, it's real, right? So we've kind of made it a joke because we know that it happened. So then looking at that context, right? Because a theme that I kind of heard today is, right, when people don't feel heard, that's when behaviors and actions and things happen, right? Like we cope, a lot of times, sometimes substance abuse is a way of coping. It might not be a healthy one, but it's a way of coping, right? So I like doing like validation and saying, okay, hey, like this isn't the greatest way, like how can we find a better way to do that? But doing it from something that I call like strengths-based, right? See where their religion kind of peaks in, because you have to also remember, yes, you're raising your child in a faith, but that was your faith. And there is some inherence of like you want your child to believe in the beliefs that you have, and right, like as parents, we're kind of setting them up, but they might not. And it's okay to say like, you know what, maybe you're not here and that this isn't where you want to be. I know I struggled myself. Like I grew up in the Catholic faith and I literally was sitting in church, I mean, with my parents and with like, the nuns and, saying things, and then people were like, oh, no, that it's dogma. And I'm like, great, but I have a question that you're not answering. And then that actually pushed me away from my faith, right? And then that's not something that we want either, because when that happens, you don't feel heard, and then you will seek it maybe somewhere else. So you might not agree with what your child is saying, but, and saying, okay, let me hear you out, create that space. And you might never see eye to eye on that piece, but kind of just saying, I hear you. We might not be able to come to that same space on this, but how can I support you? right? Because we're not asking you to change your, how you interact with your spirituality or religion, but your child might not have that same interaction that you're having, right? So then saying it's okay for us to be on different planes and still be able to be there, support each other, and love each other. Thanks.
Yeah, I completely agree with both of my esteemed panelists. Don't you love when you hear that on other panels? I'm like, let me just throw that phrase out there. In any case, I agree. And this is actually the field in which I work. Sometimes I get clients that are of the same faith, but oftentimes I don't. And obviously, newsflash, I am Muslim. But I work with everyone and anyone. And when I'm specifically working with a client that is religiously or spiritually inclined, because someone did post in the comments, and I think that is a very good, and a very important distinction. Spirituality and religiosity are not necessarily the same things. But whenever I do work with someone who is, religiously and spiritually inclined, and that is something that is important to them, regardless of their faith, one of the first things that I challenge them to do is to find a verse from their religious book, if they have one. Find at least 5 verses that talk about the mercy of God. Right? Speaking to Tiffany's point, I think it's not necessarily religion that has done this. I think it is those who propagate religion. We have taught people that God, whatever you believe in, is unmerciful, even though what he has said in all of the 3 Abrahamic religions is the exact opposite. So I challenge them to find verses in their holy books that speak of God's mercy. And the reason that I do that is because they're going to need a lot of mercy and grace for themselves on that journey. They need a lot of mercy for themselves on that journey. And if they don't have the ability to get that, to go back, if they don't have something tangible to go back to, then they will go back to what is comfortable for them, which is shame and judgment. So I always challenge them, find me 5 verses from your holy book that speak of God's mercy. Hold on to those. Those are the ones you memorize. When things get difficult, your belief system is important to you, go back to it. What does God say? If you come to him with the sins the size of the ocean, he is capable of forgiving that in an instant. And this is what our religion teaches us in Islam, but any religious book. And I think for me, one, it makes our religious beliefs more applicable to our lives. And 2, it makes God tangible, right? It makes something that we actually, we're not weaponizing it per se. So that's where I would start. And then kind of building upon that, like when someone is struggling, if they may have relapse is common. And oftentimes it's to be expected, right? You don't ride a bike for the first time and then expect not to fall. Each time you get on, you get better at it. You work out the kinks that you found the first time you rode the bike. And by the second and third try, you're doing better, less likely to fall off, so to speak. So those are some of the things that I definitely share with the folks that I support, and taking the stigma away from God, because we have to repair his reputation in our hearts, especially those of us who believe. And this is not, I'm not trying to convince anybody to believe if you don't believe, but what I am saying is that we have to repair his reputation in our hearts and minds, so that when we are confronted with those who use God to shame and blame and push their agenda, we have our faith to go back to and say, no, that's not what he said. He said this, he said that. He told me that if I do this, he'll do that. And he's shown me that. And I'm going to look for evidence of that in my life to help me with my sobriety. So I hope that answers the question. Sorry if I was a little long-winded.
Oh, that was great. Thank you.
Yeah, no, first, sorry, that was actually really great, because it was something where I think you kind of really hit it on the head. Is I've always said, like, religion is when you kind of look at the bigger aspect of it, it's amazing. It's sometimes it's the practice of how we do religion,
Right.
and it's the people who can perpetuate things that can make it problematic. And that's what happened for me. I mean, thankfully, like I found a way back, but that was through like, you know, me also wanting to, you know, kind of experiencing other people or experiencing things in my life.
Right.
But it was like, you know, having my curiosity, right, kind of shut down when I'm at an age being told to be curious and just being told to be shut up and silent. Like,
Yeah.
it shut me down, you know, not even just from, you know, my religion, but like from other aspects, right? Because now it's like, okay, this
Absolutely.
isn't safe and I don't get to talk about things and you
Right.
don't care what I feel. Right? Because religion is it's a core piece of you, right? Like that kind of defines your perspective in life.
Right.
So I would just like be careful with that. Just, you know, this is me sharing my own piece, but I know that it was defining and damaging for me at an age. You know, and yes, we can repair things and it's great that we have other people to learn from, but we don't want the people that we hold close to us be a part of some of that damage. And sometimes we are, and it happens. But if we know that, right, it's also okay to acknowledge that maybe something that you did was okay, right? So like modeling is okay. We are teaching them that there are times that we make mistakes and that there are ways then we can make up for them, right? Like we're letting people know that you can fall. And as an adult, I even did something wrong, you know, and letting them know that it's okay to apologize. It's okay to be wrong and not always be right about it. But I actually really appreciate like everything that you just said personally.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Okay, our closing question. We covered a lot of ground this evening. So can we recap some of the techniques or tips parents and caregivers can take when dealing with our BIPOC youth? I scribbled down some of them that I heard our panel share. Check in with our children and the educating team serving them in schools, actively listening to our youth, being curious of what they're doing, building a network of trusted professionals that you can lean on when we need an extra hand to support our youth, and paying attention to differences in our young ones' social life, sleeping habits, and grades. Anything that I missed, panel?
I don't think you missed anything, but I wanted to add something just based off what Tiffany mentioned. The power of an apology from a parent, right? A meaningful apology, not just some, oh, I'm sorry, because obviously after a while it loses its potency. But the power of an apology when we do make a mistake for our children, it is modeling imperfection. It is literally modeling imperfection. And I feel like as parents, we are constantly modeling perfection for our children, or we're trying to, and we fail miserably. Like the power of an apology for our kids, it lets them know, listen, mommy makes mistakes and then I come back, or daddy makes mistakes and then I come back and I acknowledge it and I apologize to you sincerely. So I think the power of an apology.
Yeah, and I would just lastly, it takes a village. A way that I like even, so when I was in grad school, we learned about a Bronfen-Brenner model, which is also kind of like, I think low key what Children's Aid used. So it kind of, right, it's the core that is the child themselves, right? So, or the person. And then you have the family that's around them, right? So the people that they live with. And then your bigger community, right? So that could be the bigger family unit, right? So cousins, uncles, grandpas, those people, your schools, the community, and then like the bigger piece of that actual big community, right? So like looking at, it takes everyone and everyone is kind of playing a part. And, you know, if we're checking in about all those things and we know about like all those aspects that are happening or try to know about those things, that's where the difference is, right? But it's not going to be just what you're doing. There's a whole community, there's all of these factors that are at play. So knowing that it takes a village to raise your child, and it's okay to utilize supports. You know, when we look at mental health, a lot of times, right, people don't look at mental health as being health, and it is the stigma. And I say, like, there's times where you handle it by yourself. There's times where, you know, you don't now feel so well, you go to your mom, dad, you know, whoever your caregiver is. And then sometimes you need even more than that, and then you go to a professional. And right, so like it's kind of saying like that's okay, like right, there's a model of how we do things for health, and that's the same way that we do things, you know, for social access, for mental health, for wellness, right? It's about being well, and we want to be well in all of those areas. So I really think it's that village of people, and even as a parent, right, you have those same supports. So like if you're not really there yet, hey, maybe it might be, you know what, you really listen to your aunt, or you really listen to you know, this person from the church or whoever from the school, right? You might not be that right person for that job, but then lean on that support. It doesn't always have to be you. You don't have to be the martyr of the story. If there is someone else who can really get that message across and be helpful, it's okay to bow out and let that next person step in.
Anything you'd like to add, Dr. Power?
No, my esteemed colleagues have done a wonderful job.
Very thorough indeed. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us. I also can't help it, so I'm going to plug our event one last time. I'm going to drop the flyer into the chat. If you have any young people that you'd like to make them aware of this event, we're going to have a follow-up sequel to this where we hear from young people, how they're managing their stress, and hopefully uplift some strategies that are working for our young people. So thank you again for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you again in a future event. Bye,
Thank
y'all.
you.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Excellent.